Hello. Mm. Hey, Rachel.
Hey, how are you?
I'm okay. I'll be up in your neighborhood this weekend.
Oh, yeah? Whereabouts?
Um, Somewhere near Savannah.
Okay.
The I guess it's just south of Dillsboro.
Okay. Cool.
We're gonna go. So Mary Beth's sister had a son that died,
Oh,
and
okay.
he had a house up that way, and they want to do a quick primp up, get it ready.
Oh,
So
sure. Yeah.
we said we'd go over there on Saturday and help out.
Nice. Very good.
Hey gang, what's shaking?
Hello.
Hey there. I know it was a Sunday, but good food, pretty nice affair on Sunday evening
Oh,
for the
yeah.
Gleiches.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Yeah. Okay. That's great. Was there a lot of people?
125?
Wow, that's pretty good, I would say.
Yeah, I'd say about less than half was actually from the synagogue.
Oh, really? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, very good.
What is
Yeah.
all this?
It's for the
Sunday.
Gleisches award.
Oh yeah.
Hmm.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Sue.
Hi Sue.
Hey, Sue.
Are you hiding from us, Chris?
For your own protection, I just got up. I'm on nights right now. I feel like a vampire and probably look like one.
Okay.
You don't seem too concerned.
How's the weather?
Well, up here in Asheville or Black Mountain, it's dreary and wet looking, but not terribly cold. How are you? How's your weather?
It's been in the 40s and sunny here today.
Say.
We had some snow last week,
Oh,
but it's all gone.
yeah. It's supposed to be nice. I mean,
Excuse me,
it's
excuse me for eating. I have another meeting after this, and I have to cram everything in.
yeah, sure.
What I started to say is when I moved to Massachusetts, my daughter said, "Boots, boots, boots, Mom, you have to buy boots." Those
Oh.
boots have yet to see the ground. There has not been a lot of snow that stayed around.
Mhm.
So I've apologized for eating. I know it's very rude, but I have another meeting right after this, and I just have to cram everything in.
You're excused.
Well, that's what I just did, Sue. I just finished
Mhm.
eating. So
How are you, Harold? It looks like you're home.
yeah, I am. I am. Chris, you said Black Mountain. Black Mountain's like 80 miles from you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm
Pretty much
working.
exactly.
Well,
I'm
I
working at.
know I know that
I,
for a fact because Mary Beth lives on the other side of Black Mountain between Marion and Morganton on
Oh.
Lake James.
yeah, yeah. That's further east of here. No,
Yeah.
I'm up here at Burnett Reservoir helping. They have an emergency water treatment facility helping the city of Asheville get their water treatment plant back up and running after Helene. So that's where I'm at right now.
Okay. Yeah, I was telling Rachel I'm going to be up past Cullowhee on Saturday.
Where are you going to be?
She hasn't given me the exact address. Somewhere like Dillsboro, Savannah.
Oh, Dillsboro. Yeah, that's right down the
It's
road.
very close.
Yeah.
It is very close.
Yeah.
What are you doing up there? Especially if you don't know
Gonna
where you're
help
going.
help do some quick fix ups on her sister's son's house that they're about to sell.
Sister's son's house. Okay.
Yeah, he passed away unfortunately, unexpectedly.
Oh no.
Yeah, I guess it's 6 months to a year ago. And so
Oh
they
wow.
debated whether or not to turn it into a VRBO or rent it and they've decided to sell it. So
It's it's a time to sell out there. Everybody's buying everything.
yeah.
Hmm. Okay, well, looks like who's coming is here, so I think we can get started. Um, we are up to chapter 23 in Exodus,
Oh, so we're
and
not on the
no, actually, well, we decided, the parties we're reading right now were really boring. I mean, they really are. They're basically all the details about building the sanctuary, curtain measurements and that kind of stuff. So we thought what we would do is spend a little bit more time on this parsha, and we'll catch
Okay.
up later with the regular cycle. Okay. So we're
Hey, I like
we're on.
that, decorating stuff and,
You do.
color of the
We'll
drapes
do
and
a little bit of that next week, maybe. Okay.
We wouldn't
Okay.
want to miss the cherubim.
Right. Yes. Yes. Okay. Um, 23 picks up on more of the laws. And again, it's just kind of a grab bag. There'll be two or three verses with one law, then another that don't have any particular connection to each other. That's kind of the pattern that Exodus follows. But the first one is the first three verses, 1 through 3. If somebody wants to read that on chapter 23.
I'll read. You must not carry false rumors. You shall not join hands with the guilty to act as a malicious witness. You shall neither side with the mighty to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty. I hope somebody in Washington is listening. Nor shall you show deference to a poor man in his dispute.
Yeah. Actually, the literal Hebrew is that you shall not follow a multitude to do evil. In other words, even if the big majority is on the side of wrong, you still don't follow them. You don't go with the crowd. Um, but the last one is kind of interesting. After all that, verse 3 says, neither shall you favor a poor man in his cause. You still have to go equal justice. You don't favor a poor man out of sympathy for it. And there's actually a story about that in the Talmud about a judge, who he was they were trying a poor man and who was guilty, and the judge, found him guilty and imposed a fine on him, and then turned around and told one of the court officers to pass the hat to get the money to pay the fine. So you can still have sympathy for the poor and do justice at the same time. And then the next one is a very brief one. It's just verses 4 and 5 about
I'll
your relationship to your enemy. So,
I'll do it. When you
okay.
encounter your enemy's ox or ass wandering, you must take it back. When you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, you must nevertheless help raise it.
Yeah. Because, there's alternate explanations that one is, that even your enemies you owe some common decency to help them. The other is it's really the animal that you're helping. It's a cruelty to animals thing. Never mind your neighbor. But what's really interesting about these verses, though, that in the New Testament, in the Gospels, Jesus is quoted as saying that you have been taught before to love your friends and hate your enemies. I teach you to love your friends and love your enemies, which is really false. There's nowhere in the Torah that it says to hate your enemies. And here you have a couple of verses that says that you still have to treat your enemies decently. You don't have to love them. That's kind of a commandment nobody can really fulfill anyway. But you still have to, you have to treat them with common decency, and help them if you can. But it's amazing how many Christians actually, when reading the New Testament, really believe that the Torah teaches us to hate our neighbors, to hate our enemies.
Some days it's hard not to.
If some days it really is, yeah, yes, it is. But then they go back again. They start off by equal justice for rich and poor. But then you get these two verses about your enemy's animal, and then they flip right back, to talking about the justice system again, and that's verses 6 through 9. Somebody wants to read that.
Sure. You shall not subvert the rights of your needy in their disputes. Keep far from a false charge. Do not bring death on those who are innocent and in the right, for I will not acquit the wrongdoer. Do not take bribes, for bribes blind the clear-sighted and upset the pleas of those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt.
So here again, it's just talking about equal justice. What's kind of interesting, though, when they're talking about the innocent and righteous slay not, for I will not justify the wicked. What the rabbinic interpretation of this actually is, if you have a capital case where somebody's on trial for murder, you still have to you still have to do equal justice. If you're not going to find him innocent of saying that, well, God will take care of it. God will punish him. God will not just, God is not going to justify the wicked for you. You have to take care of them. So it's another aspect. But again, it shows you how they chop everything up in small bits, over here. And then they basically go to a totally different subject where they take up the sabbatical year. And that's verses 10 through 13. But somebody wants to read those.
Sure.
I can.
Mhm.
6 years you shall sow your land and gather its yield, but in the seventh you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave let the wild beast eat. You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the seventh day you shall cease from labor, in order that your ox and your ass may rest, and that your home-born slave and the stranger may be refreshing.
So, yeah, and this basically, starting off with the Sabbath, that's the second time we've had the Sabbath commandment. We read it in the Ten Commandments a little bit further back. But it's funny, each time the Torah talks about the Sabbath, they give it a little bit different rationale for doing it. in the Ten Commandments, it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it, because in 6 days God created heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested. So in a sense, it's an imitation of God. Here they're saying to do it because it gives everybody a chance to rest and be refreshed. Later on, we're going to have this again in Deuteronomy, and it says that the Sabbath is a commemoration for the liberation from Egypt. So every time it brings up the Sabbath, it gives a little bit different reason for doing it. The sabbatical year, apparently they did keep. And apparently what they do during the seventh year is that you still have your animals. So you have milk and cheese and meat, from your flocks and herds that you can get by the year. And again, if you have fruit trees, they're going to bear fruit without necessarily anybody working on them. And the idea of anything grows by itself, as far as grain in your field or something, that's what you have to leave, for the poor. And actually, there's a lot of evidence that this actually was very strictly adhered to. The best historian we have of the Greco-Roman period, at least, was Josephus. And Josephus actually describes a episode during the wars of the Maccabees against the Greeks, where during a siege, they got in trouble because it was the year after the sabbatical year, and they had run out of provisions. So apparently it was something that they kept to. So, in fact, in Israel today, there are Orthodox farmers. Well, what they do, which I think it's kind of is cheating, is that they sell their farm to an Arab, to a Palestinian Arab, for that seventh year. And so it really is not their field for that seventh year, which I think is kind of an underhanded way of getting around getting around the rule. The other thing they don't mention is that there's actually a good agricultural reason for doing it. Letting the field lie fallow every 7 years, which actually renourishes the soil, and you can make a case for it. Not necessarily because it benefits the poor, but because it benefits the farmer. You're not going to rotate crops, and the next best thing is every few years let the land lie fallow, and then plant it again. So there's also another rationale for it. And the rule is repeated really 3 times. It's repeated twice more in Leviticus, and then they repeat it again in Deuteronomy. But the interesting thing is in Deuteronomy, they also throw in an extra that you have to remit all debts during the seventh year, which again didn't work out very well because once you got into the Greco-Roman era, basically, who's going to lend money to somebody if the sabbatical year is coming next year? And so the rabbis had to get this workaround, and they didn't do it for the benefit of the creditors. They did it for the benefit of the poor, because who was going to lend to the poor if they knew that it was all going to be canceled with the next sabbatical year? So it was actually Hillel, who's given credit for it, who invented this kind of legal fiction where the debt was sold to the Sanhedrin for that seventh year. And they held in kind of an escrow for a year, and then went back to the creditor. And so that was kind of a workaround with that. And then as it goes on to a totally different subject, starting with verse 19. And verse 14, I'm sorry, verse 14 through 19 describes the 3 main pilgrimage festivals. If somebody wants to describe that, read that from 14 through 19.
Sure.
3 times a year you shall hold a festival for me. You shall observe the festival of unleavened bread, eating unleavened bread for 7 days as I have commanded you. At the set time in the month of Abba, for in it you went forth from Egypt, and none shall appear before me and empty-handed. And the feast of harvest of the first fruits of your work, of what you sow in the fields, the feasts of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather the results of your work from the field. 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the sovereign Lord. You shall not offer the blood of my You wanted me to keep reading through 19. I'm sorry. You shall
Just
not
through 19, yeah.
shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with anything leavened, and the fat of my festal offering shall not be left lying until morning. The first fruits of your soil you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. Oh, now we're going to get kosher.
Yep. Yep. You shall not feed the kid in its mother's milk. Yeah. One of three repetitions of that. Yeah. What they're describing here are what are called the three pilgrimage festivals. And those were the 3 times a year where everybody was supposed to come to wherever the central sanctuary is, and sacrifice there. And actually, they really are built on the old Canaanite harvest festivals. Passover in the spring is the barley harvest. And then 7 weeks later, you have Shavuot, which is the wheat harvest, and then you have Sukkot in the fall, which is the fall harvest. Um, in fact, after the barley harvest and Passover, the rule was you had to bring an omer of barley as as a gift to the temple every day until the start of Shavuot, 7 weeks later. And we still honor that custom sort of in the synagogue. The 7 weeks between Passover and Shavuot, we count the Omer. It's sort of a remembrance when they actually did bring an Omer of barley every day to the temple. Um,
How
the
much is
problem,
an Omer, Fred?
I think it's about a half a bushel, but I'm not exactly
Okay,
sure about that.
okay.
Yeah. The real problem with Shavuot was that there really wasn't any reason given for it, for having it, other than the fact that it's just another harvest festival. And the rabbis kind of didn't like that. We'll read a little bit later. They go over this again and give more specific instructions. But you basically start on the first day of Passover, count 7 sevens, 7 weeks, and the next day, the 50th day, is Shavuot. And it kind of, like doesn't make sense to say we're having a holiday because it's 50 days after the last holiday. And so the rabbis decided that was the day the Torah was given on Mount Sinai. And so that's now is the official rationale for Shavuot. Even though if you look back in Exodus, the Torah wasn't given until more than 3 months after the Exodus from Egypt. So that really doesn't add up. But that's what they decided to do with it. Um, it says only males, but according to Josephus, who again is the best historian at the time, most people brought their families with them. But you really have to wonder, if somebody could really do that 3 times a year. If you live in Jerusalem, fine, no problem. Once Solomon built his temple, everything was centralized there. But what if you're a farmer in the Galilee, up in the north of Israel? It's a good 2 weeks at least to walk down or ride a donkey, down to Jerusalem. So let's say you go down there for Passover, and you're there for a week celebrating the Passover festival. It's going to take you a couple of days, a couple of weeks to get home after that. And then Shavuot is only 4 weeks away. Are you really going to turn around 2 weeks later and go back again for Shavuot? It really doesn't. You really have to wonder if this actually got carried out in practice. I mean, you could see somebody coming for either Passover or Shavuot in the spring, and 3 months later coming back for Sukkot in the fall. But it's really hard to imagine that somebody in the north of Israel could really get down there for all these three festivals, every year. And, and in fact, that really, some historians believe that's one of the reasons that the country eventually broke up into the northern and southern kingdoms after Solomon died. The people in the north really were kind of cut out of things. They really could not do things like this, offering at all the major holidays. Um, and because when Christianity began, the church basically, held on to Passover. They just made it Easter instead, celebrated something else, and they reworked Sukkot to be Pentecost, which is the Greek for 50, since it's 50 days, after Passover. So they basically kept these same holidays, but again, simply reworked the purpose for the holiday. Um, and then, of course, that the very last thing on verse 19, you shall not bore the kid in its mother's milk. which actually is present 3 times in the Torah, and nobody so somebody thought it was pretty important, but nobody knows what it really means. The best guess the archaeologists have been able to make is that it was probably a pagan fertility rite where you took the firstborn of an animal and cooked into its mother's milk, and that was supposed to maybe guarantee fertility for the entire herd. And how the rabbis got from that to the kosher rules we have now it's a pretty big jump. And I think you may have heard this before. But, one of Rabbi Marco's favorite jokes about that, as Moses is up on Mount Sinai getting the law from God, and God says, Moses, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And Moses says, okay, I see. You want us not to eat any kind of milk dish with any kind of meat dish. No, Moses, that's not what I said. I said, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, I get it now. You want us to have 2 separate sets of dishes for milk and for meat. No, Moses, I just said, just don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, now I understand. You don't want us to eat any kind of meat dish for at least 4 hours after any dairy dish. Never mind, do what you want. Yeah, I think of all the kashrut rules, that's the one that really has the least connection, to the literal text of the Torah. If you think about it.
And from
And then
that one sentence, we constructed all of the rules of kashrut.
Well, it's a crazy mixture because some of it is taken literally from the Torah. I mean, there's
Okay.
nothing equivocal about it, but there's others that the rabbis just kind of invented that really have only a very little connection. A good example is, the basic laws are in Leviticus. Any animal, any land animal has to have a cloven hoof and also has to be a ruminant. What the Bible describes as bringing up the cud. So that's pretty clear, which land animals you need, which you can't. For anything that comes out of the water has to have fins and scales. Everything else is out, and that's pretty clear. And then it gives a list of birds that can't be eaten. Everything else is okay. And so, as far as the Torah is concerned, all that is pretty straightforward and simple. But there's a number of ways that they went and modified it. In the story of Noah, after the flood, when Noah makes this new covenant with God, the rainbow covenant, God says, okay, you can eat meat, but don't eat the blood, which is fine. No, most of us don't want to eat blood along with meat, but the rabbis decided to go overboard with that, and so there's a whole routine of salting and soaking that you have to do, as part of the kashrut process, which is kind of interesting because that's how they invented kosher salt. There's nothing kosher about salt itself. It's a mineral, it's not a food. It doesn't come under the kosher laws. But what kosher salt really is koshering salt. It's salt that you use to make meat kosher. And the idea is, the ordinary salt that we use in a salt shaker, it's almost invisible once you sprinkle it on something. And so if you have a piece of meat and you want to make sure that you've really covered it completely, then you want salt that has really big flakes. And so this is how kosher salt got invented. It was just an easier way to make sure that you were covering the entire piece of meat. And of course, a lot of non-Jewish chefs decided that it was a great thing to use for other purposes. So now you see a lot of recipes that call for kosher salt that have nothing to do, with the dietary laws. And then there's the second major thing, which we just mentioned, not the kid in its mother's milk. And there the rabbis just kind of made something out of nothing, really. But then the third one, which is even more interesting, the reason the kosher meat is so expensive is, is the story of Jacob. The night before he's going to meet his brother Esau, and he wrestles with the man. And in the process of this wrestling match, it says the man reaches into the hollow of his thigh and twists it, so that Jacob, limped on his leg from then on. And the problem, of course, and so it says that we do not eat the sinew of the thigh because of what happened. The problem is nobody has any idea what the sinew of the thigh is. The Bible is really short on anatomical terms. There's no biblical Hebrew term for artery, for vein, for nerve, for tendon, for ligament. And so, there's at least a dozen structures around the hip joint that could be the sinew of the thigh. And for some reason, the rabbis of the Greco-Roman period decided that it was the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve actually would be the least likely thing to be involved, to be injured in a wrestling match, because it doesn't really go near the hip. It starts in the lower back, it runs through the buttocks, it runs, down the back of the leg. If you've ever had sciatica, you know exactly where it runs. But you really can't, it's really hard to injure the sciatic nerve by any kind of trauma to the hip. And but the problem with sciatic nerve is it makes a big problem for for butchers who are preparing kosher meat, because extracting the sciatic nerve from the hind quarter of an animal without shredding up the meat and making it useless is really high class neurosurgery. It's very difficult to do. A lot of kosher slaughterhouses don't have anybody with the skill and experience to do it properly, and you end up throwing out the hind parts of the animal. Some kosher slaughterhouses actually have arrangements with non-kosher places to sell them the hindquarters of the animal. And in fact, some really ultra-Orthodox Jews, will not eat any kind of any cut of meat from the back of the animal because they're worried there might still be pieces of the sciatic nerve there. And so that's why, the typical meat that you'll see at a Seder or any other kind of Jewish meal is going to be brisket. They always take it from the front of the animal. But, this is from a rabbinic, guess really as to what the sinew of the thigh is. My theory has always been they did it on purpose. The idea was we weren't supposed to eat meat in the first place, and God let us eat meat after Noah's flood as a concession to human weakness. And therefore, we're going to let you eat meat. We're going to make you jump through as many hoops as we can in order to do it. And on top of that, they actually made up a rule that has nothing to do with the Torah. The Torah gives no instructions at all as to how the animal is supposed to be slaughtered. The rabbis made up a rule, they can only be slaughtered by a single stroke across the neck, severing both carotid arteries. Apparently, that's the quickest, least painful death. But that's a rabbinic invention. The Torah says nothing about the method of slaughter, but it does make a difference. For instance, if you go into a kosher home, you'll almost never be served venison. But there's no reason really why not to. A deer is a kosher animal. A deer has a cloven hoof. It's a ruminant animal. There's no reason why a kosher house can't serve venison. The problem is you can't go out and shoot the deer because that would not be the proper rabbinic way of slaughtering it. You'd have to go out and trap the deer and bring it back and then slaughter it by the proper method, or you'd have to raise it as a domestic animal and then slaughter it. And nobody's going to do that. So a kosher animal is never eaten in a kosher home because of this extra thing that the rabbis threw in about the way you have to slaughter it. It's a weird system. And then the Parsha actually finishes here with a long section. What they do, it's typical of the Torah to have the long sections of laws, and then they'll suddenly break off and pick up the narrative. They'll do that, for a few verses, and then break off again, and then you get more laws. And here, after these laws, with verse 20, they break off, and then they go back to instructions about, how they're going to leave Egypt and how they're going to travel in the desert. And that really is the end of the parsha. It goes from verse 20 all the way through verse 33 to finish the parsha. Well, actually, there's a little bit more, but if somebody wants to read 20 through 33, I know it's a long read. Anybody want to volunteer for
I'll do
that?
it.
Okay.
I am sending a messenger before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have made ready. Pay heed to him and obey him. Do not defy him, for he will not pardon your offenses, since my name is in him. But if you obey him and do all that I say, I will be an enemy to your enemies and a foe to your foes. When my messenger goes before you and brings you to the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I annihilate them, you shall not bow down to their gods and worship, or follow their practices, but shall tear them down and smash their pillars to bits. You shall serve your God, who will bless your bread and your water, and I will remove sickness from your midst. No woman in your land shall miscarry or be barren. I will let you enjoy the full count of your days. I will send forth my terror before you, and I will throw into panic all the people among whom you come, and I will make all your enemies turn tail before you. I will send a plague ahead of you, and it shall drive out before you the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites. I will not drive them out before you in a single year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply to your hurt. I will drive them out before you little by little, until you have increased and possessed the land. I will set your borders from the Sea of Reeds to the Sea of Philistia, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hands, and you will drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not remain in your land, lest they cause you to sin against me. For you will serve their gods, and it will prove a snare to you.
Yeah. So there are to me, the two interesting things about this. There's verse 30, where it says, or verse 29, where it says, I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts multiply. Which, it doesn't sound quite right, really. Why can't you conquer the land or, right away? And a lot of the later commentators thought that this was written by someone later on. It turned out things didn't go as well as they thought. They were having a tough time driving these other people out and establishing themselves. So they kind of justified it retrospectively by saying, well, we didn't want to conquer the land too fast. God told us to take it slow. Um, the other interesting thing is the borders they describe in verse 31. The Torah, there's 4 times in the Torah where God describes what the borders of the land that he's giving them should be. And they're all 4 different. None of them are exactly the same. And this is really the biggest one because he's saying, I'm set your border from the Sea of Reeds to the Sea of the Philistine, which is the Mediterranean. So the Sea of Reeds really is where the Suez Canal now, it's the bitter lakes, that used to be there before the Suez Canal, all the way up to the Mediterranean. So that includes the entire Sinai Desert. But then even more from the wilderness, which would be the Negev, and to the Euphrates, which is hundreds of miles to the east. If you take those borders, not only would Israel have the Sinai Desert, it would have a pretty good chunk of southern Syria, most of southern Iraq, and even a little bit of Western Iran. I mean, Israel will be the size of Texas if we actually had those borders. And I'm sure there's some people in Netanyahu's cabinet really who probably have memorized these verses, for future reference. Again. And then there's a very actually I was wrong. The last part of the parsha is chapter 24, the first 18 verses, and I'll go ahead and read some of that. It finishes off the parsha. And unto Moses he said, Come up unto the Lord, thou and Aaron, Nadav and Abihu, who are Aaron's sons, and 70 the elders of Israel, and worship be far off. And Moses alone shall come near unto the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor the people go up with him. And if you've been following this from the beginning of Exodus, this may be the 4th or 5th time Moses is up and down the mountain. You get the impression it's a number of different stories that have all been blended together, and you're getting different versions of it. And Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice, all the words which the Lord has spoken will we do. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. Now, this actually is the first mention of the Torah of anybody writing any of this stuff down. We call the Torah the 5 books of Moses because there's a tradition that Moses wrote them. Most scholars don't believe that, particularly since it includes the death of Moses, describing his own death. But We here it indicates he did write something down, and it's something scholars have been arguing about ever since then. Is how much of the Torah was written down, in ancient times? Did Moses write any of it? And here, at least, he wrote something. How much of this he wrote, we just don't know. But there was some of the Torah apparently written down, even this far back. Um, and Moses built a pillar under the mount and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent the young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood, put it in basins, and half the blood he dashed against the altar. And he took the book of the covenant. And so, what is the book of the covenant? Apparently there is a book of law, and we don't know really how close that might have been to the Torah that we have now. And he read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do and obey." And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, which is kind of exaggeration. If you figure that there were 600 and something thousand people, he may have sprinkled it on a few people close to him. He said, "Behold the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you in agreement with all these words." Then went up Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. Now, again, supposedly Moses has already left them behind, gone up, got these instructions from God and come down, but now he's going up again in verse 9. Then went up Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel. And the text really is pretty plain. They saw the God of Israel. And nobody's supposed to be able to see God. God tells Moses later on, "No man can see me and live." And they again, the commentators have had a hard time explaining this. It's really hard to get around the literal meaning of a text. And there was under his feet the like of a paved work of sapphires, the like of the very heaven for clearness. And upon the elders of the children of Israel he laid not his hand, and they beheld God and did eat and drink. And again, not telling anyone where did the food and the drink come from. So this again is one of these stories that the later commentators really had a hard time with. It's really hard to make literal sense of this. And the Lord said unto Moses, "Come up to me unto the mount and be there, and I will give you the tables of stone and the law and commandments which I have written." Now, supposedly Moses has already gotten the tablets way back, several chapters ago when we read the Ten Commandments. So here he's already written down laws in a book, but now he's going back up the mountain, and this may be the 6th or 7th trip he's making up there, to get the stone tablets. And obviously, what this thing needs is a good editor. Obviously things are out of chronological sequence. The idea of Moses going up and down the mountain 6 or 7 or 8 times, if you really count all the times the book describes it, again, don't make sense. And the usual explanation of modern scholars with this is basically this is an oral tradition. And whenever you have an oral tradition, as it gets passed down through generations, you're going to get different versions of the same story. And here we have really 4 or 5 different versions of a Sinai story. And the editors decided, rather than try to figure out which is the most accurate version, we're just going to leave them all in and let later generations figure it out. And unto the elder, and Joshua rose up, and Joshua his minister, and Moses went up to the mount of God. And to the elders he said, "Tarry here for us until we come back unto you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whosoever hath a cause, let him come near unto them." And Moses went up to the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. And which makes you ask, what about Joshua? Did he take Joshua up with him or not? The text doesn't mention Joshua again. And the glory of the Lord abode upon Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the seventh day he called to Moses out of the midst of a cloud. And the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like devouring fire on the top of the mount in the eyes of the children of Israel. And Moses entered unto the midst of the cloud and went up into the mount. And Moses was on the mount 40 days and 40 nights. So again, you have another version of the story. And the question still keeps being asked: why didn't a good editor take hold of this and straighten it out? And one theory, which kind of appeals to me, is that the editing was probably done during and right after the Babylonian exile. Most scholars believe that a lot of the Bible was written by the exiles as a way to preserve their culture and history in exile, so it wouldn't be lost. And probably the overriding concern for them is not to let anything be lost. It's better to have two or three versions of the story than lose it. And so just get everything in. Main thing is not to lose anything, and let later people straighten it out later. The main thing is to get everything in. Which really, this is a good example of that. There's so many things in here that are really not compatible, but it's just something that the rabbis didn't worry about. Anybody have any questions about anything that we've covered? Well, we do have some time left, so we could go ahead to the next parsha, the one that we read last Shabbat. And as I said, it's going to be boring. It's the building of the sanctuary, and it starts with chapter 25. It starts off really the first. I think you can get the flavor of it with the first 9 verses of 25. Somebody wants to read that.
Sure. Oh,
Go ahead. Go
all right.
ahead.
The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Tell the Israelite people to bring me gifts. You shall accept gifts for me from every person whose heart is so moved. And these are the gifts that you shall accept from them: gold, silver, and copper, blue, purple, and crimson yarns, fine linen, goat's hair, tanned ram skins, dolphin skins, and acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for the anointing oil, and for the aromatic incense, lapis lazuli, and other stones for setting, for the ephod and for the breastpiece. And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them.
Yeah, so here this is sort of a materials list for all the stuff they're going to need to build the sanctuary. And you look at this, they're going to take gold, silver, brass, blue dye, purple dye, scarlet dye, linen, goat's hair, ram skins. My translation has seal skins. Some have dolphin skins, and acacia wood, plus oil, spices, and incense. All the stuff that's always lying around in the middle of the Sinai desert. So, the question is, where did all this stuff come from? Now, obviously, you can't find any of this stuff anywhere in the Sinai Desert. Where did they get it all? And the official reason that the rabbis gave was, well, you remember there is a verse before they left Egypt. God gave them favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they all went to their Egyptian neighbors and asked them for stuff. And they kind of looted Egypt before they left. And that is the only really plausible explanation for how they got all this stuff in the middle of the Sinai Desert. One thing that's really interesting are the 3 colors that they describe: blue and purple and scarlet. Because the way that they got these colors, the blue and purple are actually related to each other. There's actually a marine snail, a mollusk, that lives in the Eastern Mediterranean, and you get a clear secretion from it. And if you expose it to sunlight and heat, it oxidizes. And depending on how long you expose it, you can either get a bright blue color, what we call royal blue, or you can get a deep purple color. And the other thing, which actually they call worm scarlet in most translations, is the red color. And the most translations call it worm scarlet because it's made by crushing up a bug that looks like a worm that lives in trees. And from the Latin word for worm, you get the name of the color, vermilion. The blue, the problem with the blue and the purple is that it takes thousands of these little mollusks to make any appreciable amount of it. You only get a few drops of it from each one. So the stuff really was pretty scarce, and you had to be careful how much of it you used. For instance, later on, we're going to get the commandment with the talit, to wear fringes on your garments, and in your fringes, a thread of blue, only one thread of blue, because it's too expensive to have more than one thread. The purple was even harder to make and was very expensive. In fact, the people who lived to the north of the Israelites, in what's now Lebanon, in those days were called the Phoenicians. And Phoenicia really comes from the Greek word for purple, because they were the big traders of purple all through the Mediterranean. And by the Greco-Roman period, the purple had become so scarce and expensive that it was reserved for royalty. Roman emperors were allowed to wear it and nobody else. So taking the purple, was really a way of ascending the throne, of becoming emperor. One of the problems came that over time, probably because of overfishing, the mollusk became an endangered species, and you couldn't get the dye anymore. And so there was a big controversy among the rabbis. What do you do to get the blue dye? You can make it artificially, but then there was a big controversy. Do you have to use the dye made by the biblical method, where they used to make it, or is it okay to use artificial blue? And so you'll see, talit now, a lot of them won't have the blue thread. Because the people that make them believe that the only acceptable blue is the blue, that's made the biblical way. And then there's some, that said the Bible doesn't really say you can't use artificial color, so that will have a dyed blue thread on it. Interesting, about 25 years ago, a couple of Israeli marine biologists decided to bring back the mollusk, try to regenerate the species, and so again we'll have the biblical blue again for putting the thread into the talit. And I haven't read anything about it since then. I'm not sure where they are with that yet. If they've actually gotten back to the biblical blue again.
I think that that's my understanding, is that it is available, and that you can get the threads with this blue. That's actually, like, some Orthodox people will say, yes, this is good, and other people will say no, because the tradition was lost, but there is some that will allow it. That's what I've heard.
Yeah, I think when Rabbi Wilson was here, he had a thread of blue on his talit. I've never seen anybody else, who has it. Um, Then when you go through the rest of this chapter, it basically is just the dimensions, for making the Ark of the Covenant, for making the Ark covers, for the curtains and everything else. So unless you really are into curtain measurements, and to me, there's not a whole lot that's really interesting, in the rest of this parsha. So I think what probably should do, um, and of course, the next parsha, which we're going to read this coming Shabbat, really is pretty much the same thing. It starts with chapter 28, and again, it's more specific directions for how to make the stuff in the tabernacle. Um, but there is some interesting stuff in there. So I think maybe for next Tuesday, just to get caught up with the regular cycle, we'll start with chapter 28. The parsha is called Titzaveh, and we'll read that. A lot of it's boring, but there are some interesting things in it that are worth talking about.
It begins, you shall bring forward your brother Aaron with his sons from among the
Yeah.
Israelites to serve.
Yeah, it pretty much begins. Well,
Okay.
actually, to be really accurate, it begins with the last verse of chapter 27. With chapter 27, verse 20 is where the parsha actually is going to begin. One other interesting thing about the colors, though, that went into this, you see pictures of models that people make of the tabernacle, in the desert. And every one that I've seen, it's always like 5 different shades of beige. It's all done in earth tones. And, if you think about it, it must have really been a wild looking thing. Beige, royal blue, deep purple, vermilion, gold, and brass coating everything. it must have really been a colorful spectacle. And yet every model I've ever seen of it, just these earth tones that they put it in. I guess that they figure it just looks more religious that way, not to have a lot of garish colors there.
I think the best one is the Indiana Jones one.
Yeah, right. Okay. Anybody have any other questions or comments? Anything that we covered? Okay. We'll pick up next Tuesday with Tetzaveh then.
All right, thank
Thanks,
you.
Fred.
Okay.
Thanks, Fred.
Bye.